This panel is about whether we should have negotiations. Obviously, in international law and political practice, there's much to be said for negotiations. It has the virtue, if you can reach a negotiated settlement, of being somewhat self-enforcing, ideally. It avoids the costs associated with the use of force or solving the collective action problems with sanctions. But the question is, in the context of the current relationship between the US and North Korea and the broader North Korea missiles and nuclear weapons programs, is negotiation possible? And is it desirable? So, pretty anodyne point, I think, that for negotiations to make sense, there has to be some imaginable zone of agreement, some overlap between what the two sides will want or find acceptable. So I want to begin by asking my colleagues here on the panel what the elements of a deal that might work, that the negotiations might produce, would look like. So I'm just going to start with Robert Litvak on this. What are your views on what some of the things we might put into a negotiated deal that both sides could find acceptable might be?
Well, thank you very much to the organizers of today's event for including me, and it's a pleasure to be here today. How's this? I was once at a meeting with Henry Kissinger's being introduced, and the organizer said, "Can you hear?" And Kissinger said from the side, "If by definition, those who cannot hear will not respond." So I hope I'm audible, and I'll even shoot for clarity now. This session focuses on, is diplomacy possible? Which begs the question, if it's not possible, what are the alternatives? Basically, there are three options to deal with North Korea. The bumper sticker versions of which are bomb, negotiate, or acquiesce, which essentially means deter and contain. And we are at a point where the options are narrowing because the parties do not seem receptive to the possibility of diplomacy. And if we narrow down to the two options of either bomb, with all of the horrific consequences of that, or deter and contain, which the administration has said, President Trump via his preferred mode of communication, tweet, it won't happen, we are really at a dangerous juncture. And I think it really underscores the necessity of refocusing efforts on the possibility of diplomacy. I think there's analytical space for diplomacy. The question is whether there's diplomatic space. The analytical space is created by where North Korea is currently along the technological continuum. It's demonstrated it has a long-range ballistic missile capability. It's done a couple tests. The Defense Intelligence Agency has stated, and it's been leaked to the Washington Post, that they've mastered miniaturization. They have not yet, I believe, demonstrated the ability to have a warhead re-enter and accurately, and reach its target with accuracy. That's a complex set of integrated technologies that North Korea has not yet attained. That creates an technical space that creates an opening for diplomacy, the focus of which would be freezing, constraining the capabilities where they are at now. Because currently North Korea has 15 nuclear weapons, roughly. These are predictions based on estimates of their access to weapons usable material. 0 is not an option with North Korea, full-scale denuclearization, because they saw the US regime takedowns in Iraq and Libya. 0 is not an option with the Kim family. The question is, and it's the title of the publication which was referenced, and by the way, is available at the popular price of free on the Wilson Center website, is whether by 2020 they're going to be at 100. So if 0 is not an option, you don't want them to get to 100. A freeze, and there are a number of proponents who've pushed freeze proposals, is making the best of a bad situation. And I would argue, and this is the kind of the final point in response to your question, is it's a point of optimization among the parties. It's sort of a negotiating sweet spot, because a freeze for North Korea, it would allow the Kim regime to remain in power, which is their paramount objective, while allowing them to retain this minimum deterrent that they have of 15, maybe a bit more. For China, it would preserve North Korea as a buffer state, but would avert the strategic consequences of a full-scale breakout and holding the United States vulnerable, et cetera. And those strategic consequences could mean the redeployment of US tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea, reassessment in Japan of its non-nuclear intentions, U.S. military deployments in the region. China would have to take this into account, and I know there's some China experts in the audience. I'd be interested in their take on this. But the Chinese calculus of decision is shifting, potentially, or at least analytically, there are conditions for a shift. Finally, for the United States, a freeze would be making the best of a bad situation. We would claim that it is essentially an interim step towards long-term denuclearization. We're in a dangerous point right now. The Trump the North Korean case is called the case with lousy options, but a Trump administration official said, just because the options are lousy doesn't mean we're not going to take one.
The best of a bad lot. Kelsey, you've written on these types of topics. Do you agree with that assessment of where we could find a zone of overlap, providing that the diplomatic lack of will or opposition doesn't get in the way?
Yes, I absolutely agree. Not only do I think it's possible, but I think it's desirable, and I think it's what the Trump administration should be more focused on than it is right now. But the one element that I would add is that when considering a freeze for freeze proposal, it isn't just about what North Korea can put on the table. You also have to look, or in terms of freezing, you also have to look at what the United States might be willing to offer in return. For this negotiation to be viable, North Korea needs to feel like its security concerns are respected. And over again, you hear the North Koreans say, we're not going to negotiate while under threat of hostile policy. So how can we roll back that perceived threat of hostile policy? And one area where I actually think that there's some interesting space is to try and draw down some of the more problematic elements of the US-South Korean joint military exercises. Some of the so-called decapitation strikes that are designed to actually practice taking out North Korea's leadership. Pyongyang obviously views these as extremely provocative and extremely dangerous. And just this morning, the New York Times and others reported that there were some North Korean hackers that may have succeeded in actually obtaining some of the plans that the US and South Korea have developed in this context. So there are some options, but the United States has to be thinking and vocalizing what it's willing to put on the table in return. And the second thing I would say the Trump administration needs to be focused on is rolling back some of the mixed messages that it's been sending to North Korea. If you look at what Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is saying, in many cases he's moving in the right direction. He's saying the military option is not viable, it would be catastrophic, we'll retain it for emergencies, but we want to be focused on negotiations. However, when Trump tweets then that Tillerson is wasting his time engaging in talks, that there is no diplomatic option, this sends a very confused message to the North Koreans. As experts in Washington, we sometimes have trouble understanding Trump's tweets about North Korea. So I'm sure in Pyongyang that the confusion there is even greater. So refraining from these mixed messages, I think, could open a doorway where Tillerson, or perhaps a high-level special envoy, could actually then clearly articulate both what the United States is willing to put on the table, but also what it might be looking for from the North Koreans. And that has to include, I think, a very sort of basic set of propositions that would induce North Korea to enter into talks. It cannot include some of the excessive preconditions that we saw during the Obama administration. And right now, I think that's the only viable option forward.
Okay, well, thanks. So one of the hazards of moderating in a panel outside one's areas of expertise is even the prominent people in the field, you know the work, but you don't know the faces. And I realize I got my panelists crossed up here. So with apologies to Bridget Coggins, who's actually sitting to my left, whom I should have introduced. I've pre-introduced. I've saved the second moderator the problem of introducing Ellen Babbitt later. So with my apologies, I want to turn to Bridget and sort of say, so what would you add to the discussion we've had so far about what kinds of things are feasible or desirable in the imaginable, acceptable outcome? I mean, again, the negotiations, the thing that would make the negotiations worth happening, we've heard the zero option is essentially off the table. That's not going to work. Some things need to be done to offer some degree of security to North Korea from the positions we said. But anything else to add to that mix, or anything you would disagree with?
I do. So one of the problems that, and this is echoing what Kelsey had to say, one of the problems that we have with the Trump administration is that it's hard to understand what the United States priorities are at this point in time either. Usually it's a problem of trying to interpret what the North Korean motives are. We know that the Kim regime says over and over again that nuclear weapons are purely for defense and have no offensive intentions behind them. What we don't know right now is what the Trump administration would be willing to accept, given that I think, and it sounds like almost everyone on the panel thinks, that denuclearization as a precondition has to be off the table for the United States. Despite that, the rhetoric over and over again from the Trump administration, or from Trump himself at least, is that that's the only thing that is possible, and that military options are the only thing that will work, in spite of the possibility, I think, of real, tangible progress on the negotiating front.
Okay, so we have a choice between a problem with the U.S. position being an impossible precondition or an unclear set of goals, which clarity may or may not help. Do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, first of all, it may be news to some of you, although our Secretary of State has let the cat out of the bag. We've been talking to North Korea since the beginning of this administration. What we haven't been doing is negotiating. If you want to find out things in negotiation, you have to put a proposal down. And a proposal, and preconditions are not proposals, okay? That's the first thing. Second, my starting point would be to ask, what's in it for Pyongyang? And here, I think the discussion in public has just been nonsensical, okay? Let me just be blunt, because I'm a blunt kind of guy. I'm not a diplomat. Relations between China and North Korea have been fraught from the very beginning. To anybody who knows any of this history, which I've had to learn, I didn't know it. Kim Il-sung is wearing this is grandpa now. Kim Il-sung's wearing this toward China dates back to the 1930s, when he escaped execution by the Chinese communists who suspected him of being a member of a pro-Japanese front, when he in fact was leading an anti-Japanese guerrilla group. During the Korean War, Chinese People Volunteers vetoed North Korean plans to reunify the peninsula in the late 1950, and the Chinese may have even tried to topple him when he held out on a ceasefire. We're not quite sure of that second fact, but I think there's some evidence of that. By the way, so did the Soviets try to topple him. In 1956, Beijing forced him to reinstate purged pro-Chinese party members. So there's a fraught history here. Now, during the Cold War, Kim Il-sung played off China against Russia in order to have some freedom of action. In 1988, anticipating what many in the CIA did not, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union, not just the Soviet bloc, Kim Il-sung reached out to the United States, Japan, and South Korea in an effort to improve fundamentally the relationship. It's not about diplomatic relations. It's the end of enmity, in hopes of having a hedge against too great a dependence on China. He wanted, in effect, I think, to play us off against the Chinese the way he played the Soviets off. This is not well understood here, and it's, if you don't get this starting point, you won't understand, because that, a fundamental change in the relationship with all three former enemies or continuing enemies, it seems to be still the goal of the Kims, though we're not fully sure now. And that is important, because we are not going to get a deal unless that is Kim Jong-un's aim as well. Okay? Now, that was the basis, that aim, a fundamental change in the relationship, from Pyongyang's vantage point, was the aim of the 1994 agreed framework. That is not well understood. In fact, if you read the agreement, it says that Washington would move toward full normalization of political and economic relations. That's the actual text, okay? That's the essence also of the September 2005 Sixparty joint statement under George W. Bush, in which Washington and Pyongyang pledged to respect each other's sovereignty. That's diplomatic language for not attempting to overthrow their government, exist peacefully together, and take steps to normalize their relations subject to their respective bilateral policies, as well as to negotiate a permanent peace regime on the Korea Peninsula. That's what we committed to do. And let me tell you, we didn't do it, okay? For Washington, suspension of Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs obviously was the point of these agreements, which succeeded, by the way, for a time in shuttering North Korea's production of fissile material and stopping test launches of medium and longer range missiles. Yes, it worked. For 12 years, the North Koreans made no new fissile material starting in 91 and ending in 2003, even before the 94 agreement, because I suspect they were trying to induce us, at least they hinted at that, into an agreement, okay? Same thing happened with the Bush years. For a couple of years, we got no tests and no fissile material production, okay? Not well understood by people who say this stuff never worked. The problem was, and this is fundamental, Washington did little to implement its commitment to improve relations, and then Pyongyang reneged on denuclearization. That's the story most of you don't know, because the press is completely incompetent at reporting what the hell happened here. And I assure you, if you want to find footnoted details, I'll be happy to send it to you. It's there, okay? Now, the problem we have now is on September 15, after months of talks but no US proposal, Kim Jong-un has shown his impatience. He said his final goal is to establish the equilibrium of real forces with the US, and we have nearly reached the terminal. Is an end to enmity still his aim? We'll never know if we don't negotiate.
Okay, so to get the negotiations going from talks to full negotiations, is the necessary condition, going back to what we've just heard as the account of the agreement reached before, that is, does the U.S. need to, and do you see the U.S. reaching a position of offering those kinds of guarantees, essentially a security guarantee, a non-attack guarantee at least, progress toward normalization, and implicitly acceptance of a nuclear North Korea? Can we get there as a practical matter under current political circumstances? Whoever wants to start. Yeah.
Look, let me just unpack some of the terminology and concepts here. President Trump at the United Nations referred to North Korea, as well as Iran, as rogue states. Now, this is a term that came into the U.S. foreign policy lexicon after the Cold War. I've written about it. It wasn't a term invented by an academic to debate with scholarly friends. This was the President of the United States asserting that rogue states constituted a distinct category of states in the international system. Now, at the crux of the issue on the rogue states is the threat posed by the rogue states, does it derive from their conduct, their behavior, or does it derive from the character of the regimes? And the threatening behavior, dangerous behavior in a sense, is inextricably linked to the character of the regimes. Therefore, if you really want to turn off the dangerous behavior, you got to change regimes. That argumentation was central to the case for preventive war against Iraq in 2003. It is persisting. There is a persisting divide in the US debate on how to address the rogue states, as Trump refers to them. Take the Iran nuclear deal, which set an important precedent for constraining an adversarial proliferator's capabilities. But it was a deal. It's been called a deal. It was a deal, not a grand bargain. It was confined just to the nuclear era. It didn't address Iran's support for Hezbollah, its human rights record, et cetera. The Obama administration took the pragmatic view that circumscribing the negotiations just the nuclear issue would allow them to achieve a success. And indeed, the Iranian negotiators only had, their writ was narrowed to just the nuclear issue. Interesting kind of footnote, and it's not some fetishism about language, but Obama had dropped the term rogue state and instead referred to Iran and North Korea as outlier states, reframing it. I mentioned it sort of as a footnote for a law school organization, not in terms of a unilateral American concept of rogue, but rather in terms of conduct that violated established international norms. North Korea had, after all, joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that's why we treat it differently than, say, Israel, India, and Pakistan, which exercise their sovereign right not to join it. Now the debate, this week's headline, as anticipatory, Claire, as your meetings are, this week the president is likely to decertify Iran in the Iran nuclear deal. And what is that about? I mean, the statement is that they're living up to the letter, but not the spirit of the agreement, okay? The letter of the agreement is the agreement, right? The spirit of the agreement is everything outside the four corners of the agreement. And the reason that that tortured formulation could be made is because it really gets down to the idea of doing nuclear diplomacy with a state like Iran because of this persisting divide over whether the threat is from their behavior or from the character of the regimes. And if you don't get to the issue of the regime, you're really not addressing what's the core, the source of the threat. That is the issue we have with North Korea. It's the same overlay as we look at the possibilities of diplomacy. Because if we do diplomacy, what we're talking about in this group, and we don't have anyone, say, advocating military action on the panel, I mean, which has all kinds of horrific consequences, but it would be transactional. It would not be transformational, because the nuclear issue with Iran and North Korea is embedded in the long-term question of those societies' evolution. And we just can't wait for these timelines aren't in sync, and we can't allow this indeterminate regime transformation, change timeline in North Korea to play out while it continues to achieve this nuclear breakout.
Okay, Kelsey, you want to weigh in this?
Yeah, I agree, and I mean, I would add that every problem that we have with North Korea becomes infinitely more complicated because they have nuclear weapons. And not only nuclear weapons, but they have chemical weapons. They have a biological weapons program. So certainly, considering how these interact is critical going forward. But I actually want to add another actor into the discussion, because I think it could help or hinder the diplomatic space, and that's the actions of the US Congress. Now, Congress, of course, is not able to conduct foreign policy, but the steps that they take can either aid the president or hinder it. And I think there's an unfortunate trend in congressional politics right now that could continue to close or make more difficult the space for the president, not only President Trump, but future presidents, to enter into any agreement with North Korea. And that's the trend of Congress, and it's around sanctions. Now, sanctions are an important tool in trying to push North Korea to the negotiating table and cut off avenues of illicit finance, cut off imports that have aided their WMD programs in the past. But sanctions alone are not a strategy, but often they're perceived by members of Congress as a means to the end. And what Congress has started to do over time is shift their sanctions language so that sanctions imposition becomes mandatory upon the president and subsequently the Treasury Department, and that sanctions become more difficult to waive in the event of the agreement. And sanctions bills in Congress right now that relate to North Korea are actually containing provisions whereby if the president wanted to waive sanctions, Congress would have a vote. Now, if that had happened in the case of Iran, I say we never would have gotten the agreement we have now that's successfully containing Iran's nuclear program. So this trend, I think, is very problematic. And it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding in Congress, both about how to negotiate with North Korea, what can be accomplished, and the role that sanctions can play. So getting Congress to a position where they're more encouraging, where they're more supportive of talks, and where they refrain from these actions that may inadvertently tie the hands of the president in the event of a future negotiation, I think is critical and needs to be part of any conversation about how we actually achieve any results in this space.
Bridget?
Well, it's certainly the case that we are now in a situation where maximum pressure is being applied with respect to sanctions. We have so many sanctions that, and the people that have negotiated have seen them, it's hundreds of pages of sanctions. It's almost unfathomable how many different layers of sanctions we have on North Korea, unilateral and multilateral. And I think that for those that are saying that sanctions will work, or will work this time, I think we're fundamentally misunderstanding the logic of regime survival in Pyongyang. We're misunderstanding what the domestic political calculus is. Kim stays in power because he is surrounded by an outside world that is trying to conquer him and trying to take the regime out of power. And so sanctions actually serve to prove to the domestic populace, not fake news, but the reality that the world is trying to get rid of him. And so they're very counterproductive if we think that that's going to make him move to the negotiating table. Instead, the pressure will have to get to an incredibly extreme point before he would come to the table. And it very likely could be that the military decides that they are not willing to keep him in power longer. And collapse is not what anyone wants. It's putting a lot of savvy, it is putting a lot of trust in Kim's own ability to gauge his domestic political opposition or even his support under the threat of sanctions. And so I think that not just the military options, but the sanctions options are becoming more dangerous than we recognize. They feel good, right? No one doesn't feel good sanctioning the Kim regime. But whether or not it's actually leading to an end that we hope for, I think is an open question.
I want to pursue the sanctions question a little bit more here, which is one hears different critiques of sanctions, right? There is the critique that you just made, which is that these aren't going to work because this is a regime survival issue and you can't sanction somebody into essentially what they see as suicide. Fair enough. Another that says basically you don't know what you're going to do. You may cause a reaction other than what you expect because of the internal political dynamics of North Korea, which I think it's fair to say are not terribly well understood in the outside world. But there's the other critique of sanctions, which one hears a bit more popularly, which is they really haven't been effective because we haven't done it right. And so there's a critique of what the Trump administration has done recently, that package that finally got through the UN Security Council had about 5 minutes to work before we started hearing about alternative solutions from the administration, and that we hadn't gone very far with secondary sanctions on, say, Chinese banks and other firms. Is that argument just wrong-headed? That is, sanctions are not only ineffective, but if effective, would be perverse for those reasons. Yeah.
Let me just say that the question you want to ask of people who have the second critique is, how long will it take for sanctions to work? They say, well, they don't work until the day they do work. How long is that going to be? And while we're at it, remember, we're using sanctions to compel the North to come to the table on our terms. They're ready to come to the table, just not on our terms. So then you have to ask yourself, how many ICBMs will they make before sanctions begin to work? I don't know if sanctions will ever work, but I can't imagine they'll work very quickly. How many ICBMs will there be? How many thermonuclear weapons will they have? How much fissile material will they have produced for more thermonuclear weapons before sanctions will work? If you believe sanctions will work, you've got to give me some kind of timeline. And it is remarkable how people who advocate sanctions will not talk about when they're going to work. The history is they've never worked with North Korea, and I don't know of any reason to believe why these will work while the others haven't. The North Koreans have all kinds of ways around. They don't use banks to move money. They use middlemen, Hawala, Chinese middlemen. They don't have big ticket items like the Iranians did. Their people are used to tightening their belts. The interesting thing is they're less belt tightening now. My view is you want to bring change to North Korea, you want to do much less belt tightening. That'll bring change in North Korea. But that's a view that hasn't been tested very well. I'll stop there.
U.S. policy has been posited on the assumption of regime collapse for a long time, and it's not come to pass. In a perverse way, the North Korean regime is hyper-stable. I mean, they've endured pain that would have led to revolutions in other countries. I mean, Americans, if you just deprive them of premium cable channels, there'd be a revolution in this country, okay? North Korea had famine. I have written a lot about rogue state and why it's not a useful way to think about a very diverse group of states. Now that said, North Korea is not a normal state, right? It has, because rogue has this connotation of crazy state. It's not a crazy state, but it's not a normal state. You look at the demographic data, right? Children in North Korea are several centimeters shorter than their counterparts in South Korea, because a grotesque experiment is being run of feeding one population 1,500 calories a day and the other 2,500 to 3,000 calories a day. The GDP of North Korea, last CIA estimate, it's trended up under Kim Jong-un, but it was $40 billion 2 years ago in CIA estimate, okay? Given all the difficulties of measuring the North Korean economy. That's about the size of Dayton, Ohio, a medium-sized U city. Now the arsenal is ramping up. We're at 15 or so now. There'll be at 100 in 2020. When I got into this business, I couldn't have imagined that North Korea would have a nuclear arsenal half the size of Great Britain's, which is a little over 200. So think of this. It's a failed state with nuclear weapon run by essentially a dynastic cult. And we're into our third Kim, and it'd be an interesting paper for a student out there to write about Weber and institutionalizing, charisma, over periods of time of whether this model will work or not. But South Korea's $1.3 trillion economy, Japan $4 trillion, China 12 to 14, North Korea $40 billion. The real hardcore dilemma is, in terms of diplomacy and what path it puts us on, is like, what is the long game of the North Koreans beyond regime survival? And someone, a North Korea watcher said to me, their long game is don't lose the short game. And what we hold out as a carrot, like conform with norms and rejoin the international system, okay? Your $40 billion economy, you could be more like other former communist states that integrated into the system. And they view integration as a threat to regime survival, that a soft landing for the North Korean people is a hard landing for the regime. They're about, KDO at the Institute for Defense Analysis has looked at the North Korean regime, 26 million people. They're about 1 million people that keep the Kim regime in power. These are the people who are not eating 1,500 calories a day. They get the Toro from Tokyo if they can get it, the Remy, all the luxury goods. Shutting off the luxury goods piece that the UN's focused on is important, but not tough. And I think, picking up on a previous comment of the military, the pathway of regime change in North Korea, a pathway would be if parts of the regime flip on itself and the Kim family goes. But that's indeterminate. And we have to deal with the here and now nuclear issue, which is why, because bombing is such an awful option, it's essentially a second North Korean war, and deterring and containing this very large program is less preferable to try to constrain it through diplomacy, really points to the focus of this panel.
Kelsey?
You mentioned secondary sanctions, and so I just wanted to jump in quickly on that point. Given that sanctions are a piece of the puzzle that Congress has some control over, and given that secondary sanctions did prove to be helpful in pushing Iran to the negotiating table, there is a new push towards secondary sanctions on the North Korean front. But I think it's often very divorced from a conversation about how US partners in the region will respond to that and how it might influence the leverage or the pressure that they can bring on North Korea in the event of any diplomatic solution. China, for instance, could be very heavily targeted by some of the US secondary sanctions. Are they going to respond to this more coercive approach? Or would the United States be better off trying to engage them in a more cooperative approach that looks at reining in some of the more serious sanctions offenders in a way that doesn't necessarily embarrass China or cut these entities off from the US financial system? And I think that that's a nuanced part of the conversation that isn't happening enough in Washington because these measures are becoming mandatory. And finally, the last thing I would say, I agree with Lee. I've never seen anyone give me a time frame for when sanctions are going to work. But that's in part because sanctions aren't paired enough with diplomacy and with providing North Korea with a clear picture of what the off-ramps are to actually relieve some of those sanctions. And that's why US policy has gotten so out of balance. President Trump calls his policy towards North Korea maximum pressure and engagement, but right now there's an engagement deficit and a hyped emphasis on the maximum pressure that Congress is feeding into. But if you can bring that back into balance, I think sanctions might be more effective and they might be a more integrated part of the strategy because North Korea could actually see where they would be relieved.
Bridget, anything on this topic? Or?
No, I think that's great.
Okay. So one of the anti-engage negotiation lines has been that if you engage negotiation with a rogue regime, or even if you don't want to label it a rogue regime, an outlier regime that has a history in the critique of not doing a very good job of following through on prior agreements, that you're essentially either being a chump or perhaps rewarding and legitimizing bad behavior. And at best, you're wasting time, and at worst, you're worsening the problem. So with that sort of devil's advocate piece out there, what's the response to that?
If you think you were legitimating a bad regime, and obviously this is a bad regime, why would we negotiate with the Soviet Union back when? Why would we negotiate with Saudi Arabia now? Why would we negotiate with Pakistan now? Why would we negotiate with Cuba now? It's a nonsense argument. If you want to try to change their behavior, one way that might work, there are no guarantees, folks, I don't think I have to tell anybody in this room, is to negotiate and see what you can get. And to get things, you have to give them things they want. It's as simple as that, and it may not work, but I don't know a better way out of our problem.
There's this quote that you only negotiate with your enemies, right? And you might think that it's Tyrion Lannister if you hang out with the people that I do that watch Game of Thrones. But very recently it was said by F.W. de Klerk. And he was talking about what he thought might be the conditions under which North Korea might start to move closer to the United States in terms of its engagement. There are a number of things that the North Korean regime has said that it wants, and they're things that are pretty cheaply arrived at by the United States. They're long-term negotiating paths, but they're things like a permanent end to the Korean War, right? Rather than an armistice, which is now part of the sticking points, part of the stumbling block to why it is that the North is not engaging with South Korea and President Moon Jae-in's multiple entreaties to attempt to lessen tensions. There are things like the gradual normalization of diplomatic relations between North Korea and the United States. These are things that are very small things. These are a pittance for the United States. The United States is a great power and should start acting like it. These are small things that we can do, and negotiations are not in and of themselves a reward for North Korea. They're negotiating things that they don't want to negotiate on. So I think that fundamentally just misunderstands the situation.
In the book that was referenced in my introduction, Outlier States, I looked at these tough non-proliferation cases, but sort of embedded that analysis in the broader question, kind of the IR question of like, how can diplomatically isolated states be reintegrated into the international system, the proverbial kind of family of nations? And there are different pathways. And the South African case is one such pathway, which is when the ruling regime, the core interest groups that constitute the regime in power, when their strategic calculus shifts. That happened in South Africa in the late 80s. And it was an intense debate within the white community on embarking on that path. I don't see that happening, with North Korea right now. I think the pathway, if there is going to be, if there is a regime change in North Korea, it's going to be sudden and unexpected, like the way Ceausescu fell in 1989. And Ceausescu used to visit his good friend Kim Il-sung, and he sort of envied his cult of personality and took a lot of that craziness back to Bucharest, including a palace that, as a friend described it, makes Versailles look like a Motel 6. But I'm a card-carrying utilitarian, and I think one has to honestly address there is a moral hazard negotiating with North Korea because there's going to be something in it for them. There will have to be some type of economic inducements, probably in addition. I don't know if we've priced ourselves out of the security assurance market after the regime takedowns in Iraq and Libya, but certainly deploying a peace treaty to supplant the armistice is a good idea and may speak to some of their concerns. But basically, the nub is this, which is that North Korea, what we are dangling out, and it's tied up in this word, the Korean word juche, self-reliance. What we view as an inducement, they view as a threat to regime survival. We want them to integrate into the system. They're into like perpetuating their short game because that's the only way they can think about a long game. And they would also retain a nuclear arsenal. So there is a moral hazard of negotiating with them. You have to be upfront about it. But as a card-carrying utilitarian, I want to lower the number of nuclear weapons that pointed at the United States that could reach us.
I would just add one small point. There's still a lot that we don't know about North Korea's nuclear program. There are big questions about how many facilities they might have to enrich uranium for nuclear weapons. There's a lot we don't understand about their declaratory policy, how they would escalate in the event of a crisis. This information, these types of insights, can also be gained from the process of negotiations. So even if a deal is a long time in coming, even if a deal is never reached, the information gained can still be very helpful in terms of how US policy is calibrated towards North Korea.
So you've just mentioned the uncertainties we have, and that information obviously be valuable in figuring out how much one gives to get various solutions, what's the magnitude of the threat. In terms of reasons to negotiate with North Korea, how compelling or significant is the concern not with the nuclear weapons program in North Korea per se, but the proliferation risks? How much is that an additional reason, and how does it play into the argument for negotiation? Well, let's start with Kelsey.
One of the things we're watching, I think, and I defer to Japanese experts who've been very quiet on the subject, is we have in Tokyo, in our ally, a prime minister who whispers in Trump's ear and gets him stirred up, and who has publicly come out for never negotiating. Not negotiating now, never negotiating with North Korea. Now think how that will work. If we have any guesstimate as to where the North Korean nuclear and missile programs will be in 5 years, what do you think the argument will be in Japan? For those of us who cut our teeth working on European security in the State Department, I can tell you what the argument's going to be. Will the US trade Los Angeles for Tokyo? We better have nuclear weapons of our own. I think this train is coming on. It won't happen in Abe's term, but that's what I worry about, because think of what the region and the world look like. If Japan gets nuclear weapons, what do you think the Chinese reaction will be? And what do you think the South Korean reaction would be? I was involved when we had to stop South Korean nuclear weapons programs, and we had to do it twice. Okay? This is what I worry about. I don't worry about a nuclear war in Korea. I worry about a real change in the fundamental security relationships, in the fundamental alliance relationships that we depend on for getting our way in the world. And one of the things that concerns me about this administration is thank goodness for Mattis and Tillerson, they seem to understand and appreciate that allies matter. I'm not sure the president does.
Kelsey, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I will say, though, I am slightly concerned about a nuclear war, just as an aside, but
We can all agree it's bad, but let's see.
We can get back to that later. But in terms of your question about proliferation, I think it's not just the question of what other states in the region might go nuclear, but what is North Korea willing to provide on the black market? And I think that their concerns are overstated about whether or not North Korea would actually sell a nuclear device. But there is clear evidence of North Korea's willingness to cooperate, both on delivery systems and actually building the facilities that produce material for nuclear weapons. North Korea was very involved in the reactor that Syria was building. There's clear evidence that they have provided cooperation on Iran's ballistic missile program in the past. And the little that we know about interdictions of dual-use goods, so goods that can be used for conventional or WMD purposes, some of those have originated from North Korea and were bound for various locations in the Middle East. So I think that that certainly is a concern. And again, we can't just keep that focused on the nuclear element. I mean, in a very high-profile case earlier this year, North Korea used a chemical agent to assassinate the half-brother of Kim Jong-un. Was this a declaration of North Korea's chemical capabilities? Probably. Was this North Korea demonstrating to others that chemical agents are something that North Korea can manufacture and perhaps sell? I mean, that's a concern that I have, how that's perceived and what direction North Korea might go into there. So I think that that is another reason both to pursue negotiations, but also an element to think about when the US does actually enter into talks. What sort of premium do we put on the non-transfer part of any agreement?
I'm glad you referenced the nuclear terrorism issue because it's been sort of a driving scenario since 9/11, the worst scenario. We can't agree on virtually anything in this country politically, but when you ask politicians what's the greatest threat, they'd say a nuclear weapon in the hand of a terrorist group. This is a small probability event, high consequence. There are two pathways of terrorist acquisition. Leakage, that is inadequately secured materials or weapons falling into the hands of a terrorist group, and you think Pakistan and Russia, just because there's so much in Russia. And then the other route is transfer, like deliberate transfer through sale or for a political agenda. And the country that one thinks of in that context is North Korea, which former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said would sell anything to anyone, and they indeed have engaged in illicit activities, counterfeiting $100 bills, methamphetamine, produced at what normal pharmaceutical labs, so it's flooded, a host of counterfeit cigarettes, et cetera. To raise about $1 billion a year to keep this million people I referenced kind of the hard currency to keep them sated and to keep the Kim regime in power. U.S. declaratory policy is one of calculated ambiguity, saying that the United States would take into account the origin of nuclear material if a weapon was used. And that's really a hedge against Russia, saying that we wouldn't want to be caught into automaticity of response if a Russian origin weapon went off somewhere. But with North Korea, the one country that really we do think of as a threat of transferring, I think it's a low probability event, we should probably tweak our declaratory policy to say that that would be really it would trigger a regime-changing response. Because if North Korea is actually selling to ISIS or Al-Qaeda nuclear weapons, nuclear materials, then really kind of all bets are off with them. And I don't think they'll do it. They may be deterred, but we could tweak our deterrence policy. Just one other thing on the general topic of negotiations. It has been, I referenced it just sort of in passing, and it's obvious for anyone reading the paper. The conflict now is personalized in a way that has not been before. And cinephile, famously in The Godfather say it's business, not personal. Well, this has become personal, and Trump called him Rocket Man, and they replied. I had to hand it to the propaganda department. I think they came back with another Elton John lyric, Madman Across the Water. They also called him a dotard, which sent most Americans to their dictionary. But it's personalized, and this is the one thing that the CIA, according to the Los Angeles Times, had told the Trump administration: do not personalize this with essentially. You can't out-cult a cult, okay? Don't try to go there. It will complicate anything else you have planned. And the second thing is, and I didn't sort of really punctuate the point when I made it about the JCPOA, is that the man who wrote The Art of the Deal, this was the way you do a deal with an adversary or proliferator. Transactional diplomacy to constrain capabilities. And we're jettisoning this model, this precedent, at a time when we're talking about possibly applying this model to North Korea, which, in addition to having personalized it, in addition to running military operations right up to their border, which, given the talk about regime change and decapitation exercises, what we call deterrence, they can view as us teeing up a response, a preemptive strike, which conjures up some very bad 1914 vibes, which is why I'm more worried. I'm on the worried side of the continuum about where we're at right now, really worried. The third piece of it is, why would North Korea do a deal with us? If we walk away from the JCPOA at this point, I think all these are headwinds against it. And I argued that there's analytical space for diplomacy, but it's really going to require the type of all-administration effort, and recognizing, what Kelsey said, that sanctions are not a strategy, and taking into account where the North Koreans coming from on this, and their paramount interest in regime survival. That all has to be taken into account in sort of putting together a diplomatic strategy that stands any chance of success.
So Trump's foreign policy is often described as transactional, and that's a fair account of a lot of what's gone on. But there's a style, at least to some accounts of Trump deal-making, that there is the bluff and the bluster. You say you make the outrageous demand, the ridiculous claim, and then you back off from it. Is that a particularly dangerous, if that is a fair characterization of some of what he does, is that it sounds like you're saying it's a particularly dangerous tactic, and that's bound up with the personalization, that it will backfire here, even though it might sometimes have worked in real estate.
let me voice what I suspect will be a dissenting opinion. North Koreans are really quite realistic about propaganda. And they recognize Trump's tweets as weapons of mass distraction. If you think I'm kidding you, last week KCNA ran a story, the lead of which is the imperialists are bluffing. I think the North Koreans are well aware this is a bluff.
So,
I'll stop there.
Anyone want to weigh in on this? Okay. Let me just then, we're running up against the time where I want to turn it over to the audience for their question and participation. But in the course of our discussion here, there's been, I think we pulled together a list of things that you collectively suggest the U.S. should put on the table to bring North Korea to the table, and things that North Korea should want to seek from the U.S. as part of a negotiation, right? So the U.S. makes the following set of offers some degree of accepting a nuclear North Korea, some degree of security guarantees, and there's a lot in it for North Korea. What does North Korea need to do, or what should North Korea try to do, to get the U.S. to come to the table when we've got an administration that's at best sent unclear signals and seems somewhat reluctant to go there? What do they need to do to reach that result, and is it within the range of what they think they can do?
I think they're going to go for it. I think they wanted to develop a demonstrated capability to hit the United States with a ballistic missile and a nuclear warhead on it. And then they'll talk. And that's a whole different thing. Where we're at now, and this kind of hyperlinks to this panel too, is we are on record as saying we are not going to tolerate that. And that really opens the door to preventive military action, like they're teeing up a ballistic missile test. Are we going to use naval-based anti-satellite, anti-missile systems to try to knock it down? What if it doesn't work? What if it does work? They get a move too. And the escalatory potential, this sort of self-deterrence thing is real. Going back to, Wilson Center's got a wonderful Cold War history project, and we have documents from East European archives of conversations with Kim Il-sung. The North Koreans know we're self-contained in the sense that when they grabbed the Pueblo, we could have responded, and how. But that would have led to an escalation on the Korean Peninsula. And you have the chairman reference the photo in this building of the barbed wire. The demilitarized zone, and this is fresh to me because I wrote up on Amtrak this morning, Washington, D.C. is as close to Baltimore as Seoul is to the demilitarized zone. And they have had for decades the functional equivalent of a nuclear weapon pointed at Seoul just through conventional artillery, in addition to other unconventional weapons that were referenced. So I think the probability of war has gone from low to plausible, and this is really unprecedented. I ducked and covered during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but this is really unprecedented in my lifetime.
Your hypothesis is that deterrence doesn't work.
I think deterrence can work, but I don't. This administration is on record as saying it will not rely on deterrence against a mature North Korean capability. Now, maybe they'll pivot to deter and contain, and I'm in that camp. I think there are things we could do now to constrain the capabilities. I've talked about the freeze, but they are not there, this current administration.
Well, then I don't hear Mattis saying what you're saying. I don't hear Dunford saying what you're saying. I don't hear our USFK. They seem to think that there's a deterrent on the other side and one on our side. I think that's not altogether reassuring. After all, the steps that both sides show to the other that deterrence works can get you into firefights. That's happened a couple of times in the Korean Peninsula. And the history of deterrence with the Soviet Union is hardly a wonderful one. After all, what the Soviets did in Cuba was try to get a deterrent, which they didn't have in 1962, and they nearly got into a war. And we didn't know they had the nuclear weapons in Cuba at the time. I've read the estimates, so I assume have people in this room.
So the concern about deterrence and the concern about undeterrability, those are both, if that's the best we can do, that's the best we can do. But the goal here is a question about possible negotiations. is there anything that North Korea can or should do to move the Trump administration off the dime where it appears to be now, which is sending at best mixed messages and certainly not engaged in active negotiations?
I think, unfortunately, I agree. The North Korean position is we're going to force you to be our friends.
Right. So you'll
the way
come to
we
the
force you to
table
be our
once they
friends
cross
is we
the
keep
threshold.
testing. Right. You and I know as Americans that's not a good way to deal with Americans, but it is the North Korean way, which is we stand up to all the neighbors. That's the legitimating myth of the Kims. They've stood up to China, they stood up to Russia and the Soviet Union, they're standing up to us, they're standing up to the Japanese, and they're standing up to the South Koreans, but with a twist, which is they want us to change to end the hostile policy is their verbiage, but to end enmity. That's an interesting twist, and I think that's still worth exploring. Do they mean that? I suspect they might. And their security and their economic well-being would be fundamentally different if they could flip the former enemies.
I think that if Kim Jong-un was seriously interested in engaging and beginning a dialogue with the United States, that he should approach the United Nations Security Council. The Security Council has made very clear its outrage at the development of the nuclear program with its new sanctions. And I think that approaching a multilateral organization, whether the Security Council or the members of the Sixparty talks, that would be the way to the end run around this standoff with the Trump administration that just seems to be escalating in tensions and again, very personal.
I mean, I tend to agree with Bob, and if we look back to what happened with China, for instance, the United States didn't take China's development of a nuclear deterrent seriously. They put a nuclear warhead on the tip of a missile, shot it across the country to demonstrate that they actually had this capability and it could work. And right now, Trump is giving North Korea every excuse to go down that route, to perhaps launch an intercontinental ballistic missile into the Pacific with a warhead to demonstrate that its warheads will survive re-entry, that they'll work. And then North Korea can enter negotiations from a position of much greater strength than it could now. So given that North Korea has tried some of these other routes in the past, they've tried to make offers looking back in January, I think 2015, July 2016, and it was rebuffed. And now North Korea has this opportunity to continue to perfect its capability because it's the United States that has said it's not interested in negotiating. I think they'll continue down that route until they've achieved that capability and can negotiate from power.
I'm going to throw this out to the audience in just a moment, but in your reference to the Security Council and some of the discussions we've had in our colloquy here, we've been talking mostly about the possibility of U.S.-North Korea negotiations. Now, of course, the relatively recent history here has been much more multilateral. We've had the Sixparty talks, and they've had their frustrations. To what extent does the prospect for fruitful or potentially fruitful U.S.-North Korea negotiations depend on bringing other parties into the process, so whether formally or not? China's the most obvious one, but there are others, including the full list of Sixparty talk members that might be part of the mix. Where does that figure into this, and what do we need to do on that front to make this feasible? Bridget, can I start with you on this?
I'm not sure about the feasibility, but I do feel that the Trump administration up to this point has been excessively unilateral when it comes to North Korea, and that we're not being a particularly good ally, despite the reassurance tours that we've been seeing. I think that especially in South Korea's case, that they haven't been drawn in enough on these issues. I don't know whether or not it's only because of the North Korean regime that this is necessary, but I do think that the Trump administration needs to reach out to the members of the international community in order to allay fears about this bluster. Maybe it's the case that the North Koreans aren't taking the bluster seriously, but people are concerned. The people of the world are concerned, and I think that multilateralism will help to make clear what our intentions are, make clear the kinds of things that we're concerned about that can't translate in a 140 or maybe more.
I went up to 280 now, so
Right.
we'll be good. Other colleagues?
I would just add, looking back at the Iran case, one of the reasons why that was a successful multilateral negotiation is that there was such a high degree of cohesion amongst the parties that were negotiating with Iran. And Iran was unable to, except in very small instances, sort of pick at any divides between those countries. So I do think going forward, in the case of beginning negotiations with North Korea, it's critical to closely coordinate with other countries in the region because they do have a stake in this. It's critical that the United States continue to provide assurances to our security allies in the region that they won't be left high and dry in the event of a negotiation. And it's critical to ensure that China's viewpoints are taken into account because they are heavily vested in this. But ultimately, I think that North Korea wants a negotiation with the United States. The United States will be central, but certainly the regional element is important and should be folded in.
Again, who were we trying to persuade here? Which is the North Koreans. What did the North Koreans learn when Koizumi and Kim Dae-jung were in power? That they combined could not bring George W. Bush to the negotiating table. They learned an unfortunate lesson. So now their position is, we need to make sure the US is at the negotiating table. But that's only the first step. And you can bet they understand, because they want a fundamental change in relationships with South Korea and Japan, that they want South Korea and Japan at the negotiating table. It's just not initially, because they feel the Americans can always push the others away from the negotiating table. I think that's what's going on. Again, it's North Korea, so we can't be sure. But the US is primary because of the history here. But the notion that they don't want to talk to the South Koreans is absurd. A peace process on the Korean Peninsula, the North Koreans have always understood since 1984, involves South Korea, not just the US. It's just the US is primary given the history.
To throw this open to our audience to raise their questions. So we have microphones circulating around. If you have a question, raise your hand right here in the third row from the back. And I ask you please.
An observation and a question. There's been a lot of talk here about North Korea and big ideas like diplomacy and deterrence. Haven't heard you talk much about the guy. The guy runs North Korea. He gets up in the morning and he has breakfast. And we threaten to kill him and his people, and we're trying to starve him into submission. So my question is, if I were him, I'd build all the nuclear weapons I could. And so aren't we punishing and blaming North Korea for a situation we created?
You want to tackle that?
I think it takes two to tango.
That doesn't answer the question.
It does
What's
answer the
what's our
question.
constraint?
The North Koreans, the nature of the North Koreans regime, the history with North Korea is not one where the US attacked them. It's where they attacked the South. There's a lot of history here. So I think we have to be careful of having too simple a view of North Korea.
The guy releases prisoners and starts talks every time we send an envoy over. The guy said he wanted to talk. Whose fault is it?
The guy wants to talk as far as we know. Is the guy prepared to stop testing missiles and nuclear weapons and stop making fissile material? There were some hints he was. That's worth testing. Am I confident with 100% certainty this will work? No. Do I think the US is part of the problem? Absolutely. Do I think the US is the whole problem? Absolutely not.
We have another question in the second row over here, and then in the row right behind.
It seems to me that there's a difference between Iran and North Korea. Iran was under, from what I read, a lot of internal pressure to negotiate and to have the sanctions lifted. From what I read about North Korea, the North Korean population thinks we're the devil and has been educated that we're the devil and believes wholly in the regime. So the comparisons, I think, are not accurate, and until Kim feels some real internal pressure, is there any reason to believe that he would back off since he feels secure, and unless we really want to attack, he's safe. And the atomic bombs give him the cover that he needs. So why should he change?
Bob?
Well, since I talked a bit about the Iran precedent, let me just address your question. Yes, I mean, the polities are completely different, the culture. I mean, one is an Islamic republic, the other is this cult, basically, family cult. I was really pointing to Iran as sort of a template for how, through negotiations, you achieve transactional diplomacy to constrain capabilities. And I would just note, we devoted enormous bandwidth in our public debate on Iran in the last couple of years. There was a session here, Clara, that you put together. You know, we were talking with Iran about a latent capability. They had an uranium enrichment program, and the objective of the negotiation was to block them from acquiring the capability to produce weapons usable, i.e. highly enriched uranium. With North Korea, it became a nuclear weapon state in 2006, and they've got this large arsenal and ballistic missiles, so they are in a kind of different place. Iran also has real politics in a way that many other countries in the Middle East do not. It's circumscribed politics. They have an election. Those states across the Persian Gulf from them, do not have polities that are as where they have contested elections. I'm not pointing fingers at any particular kind of regime, but there is real politics in different interest groups, and Rouhani came to power in 2013 having campaigned on a platform of relieving sanctions pressure, which, because they were multilateral and targeting the banking sector and the oil sector, such that Iranians who were really quite integrated into the system, with the internet and banking, they were not able to engage in normal commerce. They wanted to win sanctions relief, and that was a kind of a political force behind Rouhani. You don't have that in North Korea, where the regime attempts to kind of rigidly control information. It's breaking down because it's hard to shut off an entire country. But one dynamic that has been written about recently by the North Korea watchers is the use of a foreign threat by the regime that's feeling besieged as a kind of a basis for building domestic legitimacy. And that's a factor that could limit the political space in North Korea for really having a kind of the diplomatic prospects vis-a-vis the nuclear issue or anything broader.
I'd like to push back a bit on the idea that the North Korean populace is brainwashed and believes everything that the Kim regime says. North Korea is an outlier country, but North Koreans are Koreans. And they live normal lives. They're not all brainwashed masses that are going to do anything for the dear leader. What it means is that there is support. There's a core of support for the regime, but most people aren't involved in politics every day. It's also not the case that North Koreans are every day thinking about how they might escape if the regime collapses. It's a normal polity. It's a normal set of people, and so it's given that it's difficult to think about pressure and about who that pressure is really landing on. The North Korean population is inured to struggle, but that doesn't mean that they all want to be struggling in favor of the regime, right? And we need to think, not just as the United States, but as the international community, about whether or not this pressure is the best way in which we can get the Kim regime to the table, or whether there are more morally and normatively palatable ways to attempt to make change.
Okay, a whole bunch of questions. So I think we had the gentleman in the red shirt initially, and then we'll work our way. Let's see. I'm sorry, can you all put your hands up just so I get a sense of where we're going? Okay.
This is primarily directed at Dr. Litvak. You posited an interesting dichotomy between the conduct of a regime and the regime itself. And I think that actually applies to 99% of the nations in the world, but suppose North Korea is the 1%. If they are, and the model you posit collapses, will negotiations ever work to focus on the conduct when the regime itself seems to be completely criminal in nature?
Great question. I've argued for decoupling the nuclear issue from the question of regime change and engaging in transactional diplomacy. And I did, the answer to one of the earlier questions, I did address the kind of the moral hazard of that it does, allow the regime to stay in power, the small arsenal, there will be something in it for them, which could be viewed, as propping them up. But I think that the conflation of the two is really, you won't get anywhere with the North Koreans or Iran or any of the other hard cases if you make it about regime and, given the paramount, goal of regime survival there. And that it's played out over a period of time that with many predictions of regime collapse. I just like since I'm at a university, kind of drop a footnote that, when we develop strategies, I teach a course at Georgetown about this, but when we develop strategies, our non-proliferation strategies are premised on a concept of societal change or a view of the adversarial state. Like when we had the Iran debate, there was sort of the bumper sticker, bomb them, negotiate, whatever. Each of these is viewed on a different sense. Like the bomb school, it was driven by the view that that Iran is apocalyptic and undeterrable. The negotiation school was premised as was the CIA's, the National Intelligence Estimate of 2006 or 7 on Iran, saying that Iran was subject to a cost-benefit analysis. So each of these different policy options is based on your underlying assumptions about the regime. And the footnote is just, Kennan's article, the famous containment article, and containment has been America's default alternative, it's grand strategy. When states won't integrate into the system, it's not kind of hard regime change like 2003 downtown Baghdad. It is, we contain regimes to allow internal processes to play out. And that article was telling, the X article was tellingly entitled, the sources of Soviet conduct, not containment: a strategy for the Cold War. And it was really a brilliant analysis of Soviet society, and that if we contain them, essentially balance power, the forces would play out over time and there would be kind of regime mellowing or collapse, and that came to fruition. I think that's the game plan for North Korea and these other hard cases.
The second row here in the blue shirt.
So my question is kind of about the self-sufficiency of the North Korean economy, and also mostly where, if sanctions were able to be negotiated in a very multilateral and extreme way, basically where would the money come from first in the budget? Would it come, would people start would the everyday people not in that core million people, would they start to go hungry? How would they react to that? And ultimately, would there be any sort of point where that could draw enough money from the people that there would be some sort of revolution, or maybe more likely military coup that would be inspired, or money would start to get short for the nuclear program and they would be incapable of progressing because of lack of financial resources? So is some sort of, first of all, is it possible to get a global coalition to make sanctions this severe and cut their economy that hard? And if so, where's the money going to come from first? Where are they going to cut back first? And how is that going to change things?
I'll start by making a few points. I think there's a discussion to be had between the sanctions that are on the books and the sanctions that are being successfully implemented. And implementation and enforcement usually don't get as much emphasis when we consider how effective a sanctions regime is and how effective a sanctions regime can be. I think it was referenced earlier in this panel that additional sanctions were passed by the US Congress on North Korea in July, late July. As far as I know, the implementing regulations for those sanctions have not even been put in place yet. We talk about multilateral sanctions. There are a number of countries, the majority of countries actually, that have not filed all of the requisite reports indicating that they are implementing a UN Security Council sanctions. So clearly there's a gap between what's on the books and what could actually be enforced. That being said, North Korea has demonstrated a remarkable talent for sanctions evasion and for developing illicit trafficking networks that can stay sort of one step ahead of the next sanctions measure. So I do think that there are steps that can be taken to make it more difficult for the regime to operate, to cut off some flows of cash, to cut off some access. Some of that does come at a cost. And particularly, I said earlier that there's been this movement towards mandatory imposition of sanctions with very few carve-outs for things like humanitarian commerce or other avenues. So I think there, there does run a risk of that having sort of consequences that trickle down. But I would also say that the North Korean government, and others probably have more insights than I do into sort of the historical past, has shown sort of very little regard for the suffering of its people vis-a-vis the advancement of its military programs. So going forward, I mean, even if these sanctions sort of do start to bite, where is there going to be a prioritization? So I think that is something that the North Korean leadership will continue to prioritize in terms of advancing its nuclear missile program, irrespective of perhaps some of the social costs. As for the likelihood of some type of coup or revolution, I don't know enough about sort of the internal dynamics of the society, so others might have more of an insight there as to what the likelihood would be.
So I once had a conversation with a friend who works for one of the state security think tanks in Beijing, and I said, I know you can't tell me what you know, but do you know a lot more about what goes on in North Korea than the U.S. does? They said, not as much as you'd hope. I think it's opaque even to their closest allies. We got time for a couple more questions, so I'm going to take 3 in a cluster, in the back row there, and the second row here, and then back against the wall. So just please keep your questions brief, and then we'll have the panelists respond.
One of the factors that recommended the Iran nuclear deal was a vigorous verification protocol. North Korea is probably one of the most opaque countries on the planet. How do you verify any agreement, compliance with any agreement that might be reached?
Okay, second row here.
I would just like to get back to, one of the comments Dr. Siegel made earlier was to have a negotiation, you have to have a proposal. You have to be able to present something. And then Bridget, in sort of a throwaway, said, North Korea wants some things that are very easy to give them, i.e., in particular, diplomatic relations. And therefore, why is it the U.S. keeps acting like a big me, little you, and wanting the North Koreans to capitulate when, in fact, they're willing to capitulate and talk about things if we limit the scope of the negotiation and make some reasonable proposals and look for some reasonable responses?
Okay, and then there's a question against the wall there, I think. Is that right? Is there a question back there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
This is actually for Kelsey and Dr. Litvak. You guys were discussing the timeline of sanctions and I guess the agreements around sanctions and what needs to be accomplished within a specific period of time. Hypothetically, if the North Koreans end up developing an ICBM or greater nuclear capabilities in that time, and it's undefined, what's the likelihood of U.S. strategy using cybersecurity attacks as a preemptive strike on their nuclear capabilities, like one used in Iran with Stuxnet? And for any of you who don't know what Stuxnet was, it's essentially malware that was placed, I think, by Israeli operatives in nuclear facilities, and it sped up their generators and ruined their nuclear enrichment program. So what's the likelihood of establishing a policy of using a preemptive cyber attack?
Okay, so I have 3 questions. One on what do you do about the verification implementation problem? What about the content or contours of a proposal that would be serious and taken seriously? And is there a Stuxnet with North Korean characteristics looming out there? Why don't I start with Bob and then we'll...
Great question of verification. I mean, it would be a nightmare. I mean, they have really so many facilities, a lot of them. Take when and Lee kind of referenced it, but didn't have time to develop it, the collapse of the agreed framework in 2002, which really was so unfortunate that the cause of it was the North Koreans were pursuing a covert uranium enrichment program. And in order to challenge the North Koreans about a covert uranium enrichment program of unknown scope and unknown origin, the Bush administration abrogated the agreed framework, which had the plutonium program in cooling ponds at Yongbyon, where we knew it was. When the agreement ended, the North Koreans removed the fuel pods, they separated the plutonium, and that's where the initial 6, 8, 10 weapons came from. And so there are, Kelsey's comment, we don't, unlike production of weapons usable material. There's not even a declaration to the IAEA about where all these sites are, so it would be thorny. I think one could reduce kind of the freeze and it's not maybe a freeze for freeze. I think that's been one way it's been presented, but it'd be a freeze for, as Richard Haas put it, something. Okay, we'd have to come up with what the something is, and there've been some great ideas on the panel on that. We can verify when they test nuclear weapons, and we can verify when they test ballistic missiles, and just kind of constraining those programs would be huge, as our president would say. Not precisely the way I said the word though. On cyber, I will duck it in the classic manner by saying that it's fortunate that the speaker tonight, David Sanger, did the breaking story on how we've used cyber capabilities against North Korea. And for station identification, he's at the Wilson Center right now, my home institution, on a book leave from the New York Times to write a book about cyber insecurity. And I'll duck the really hard question about strategy. So.
Kelsey, Leon, and then Bridget for last word.
You're too pessimistic about verification. Look, wait. There is, obviously, with enrichment, that's a much more difficult proposition than inspecting. Remember, we had inspections at Youngdown, as you know, and we knew what was going on there. We had people on the ground 24/7. We had all kinds of other means. Enrichment's more complicated, and there is always the possibility, we know there's a second enrichment site. The North Koreans have actually acknowledged it, by the way, if you know how to talk to them. There might be a third, there might be a fourth, but think about how you bound the problem. The first thing you do is you say you have to tell us where they are. And they won't necessarily tell you where they all are, but they will tell you where a couple of sites are. And the reason is something has changed here since back when. They have nuclear weapons. At one point, you could say they wouldn't tell you where the second or maybe a third enrichment site is, because we would bomb it. That probability has changed. That calculation has changed. That doesn't mean they will tell you where everything is, but we have sometimes ways of finding things that people don't tell us about. And so as you bound the problem, you will always have some degree of uncertainty about how many more centrifuges are somewhere else. But it is not inconceivable that over time, you can sufficiently constrain the problem with verification. So don't assume this is an impossible thing. Just assume that the likelihood of capturing all of it early on is low. That's a different problem.
Okay. Kelsey?
And I would just add, too, there's a number of lessons that I think can be derived from the Iran case that may be applicable to North Korea if we actually get to a verification point. This question about, does North Korea have facilities that they won't declare? Well, under the Iran deal, for the first time, there's a protocol that actually gives inspectors access within a time-bound period to undeclared facilities. That's something that might be applicable in the North Korea case. There are also a number of new technologies, real-time online enrichment monitoring, for instance, to assure that there's no enrichment to weapons grade. So these are lessons that I think could be applied. There's also a very interesting project that the State Department is working on in conjunction with other countries. And since I live in DC and speak in acronyms, I may actually get the title of this wrong. But the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, I think, is the gist of it. And they're actually looking at developing some of the protocols to verify dismantlement, to verify a stop in fissile material production that could be very relevant to the North Korean case. So work is certainly being done here. It definitely will be a challenge, but I think there are some interesting examples to draw upon. And the one thing I would say also, just in response to the question about cyber, yes, we did use cyber operations against Iran. But again, this is not a strategy, and it shouldn't be confused as a way to verifiably end North Korea's nuclear program. It had a small impact on a limited number of centrifuges in the Iranian case. Iran still went on to progress to rebuild those centrifuges fairly quickly. And again, in the Iranian case, there were a lot more avenues of entry into their nuclear program that we don't have in the North Korean case. So I think when talking about what cyber can actually realistically accomplish, it's good to remember that there are access differences sort of in these two cases. And again, this is not a strategy in and of itself.
And Bridget, you get...
In case you think cyber can knock down a missile, if the missile doesn't have software, cyber is pretty useless.
Yes.
Bridget, last word.
Korea problem.
So when it comes to verification, I think that we're in a cutting off our nose to spite our face situation, which is that as the program develops, it becomes more difficult. As it becomes more mobile, it becomes more difficult. And so if you do that if you won't negotiate because of the progress, as the progress occurs, it becomes more difficult to verify, right? And so this is exactly the wrong tactic to be, or this is the wrong tack to be taking if our primary concern is the development of the program. Because as we think about the details and all of the reasons why we ought not to become involved and head to the negotiating table, the possibilities for enforcement pass away. They become fewer and fewer. And this is something that definitely was a concern when it came to Iran, and it should be a concern when it comes to North Korea. As to why it is that we, the United States, haven't put some of the easier things on the table, I think that it's a persistent belief that denuclearization had to be on the table. During the Obama administration, I hear that denuclearization as a precondition might have been off the table, and it was rebuffed. I think that we should revisit at least that in our discussions with the North Koreans.
Well, we could go on this topic for hours. Unfortunately, this panel's time has run out. Fortunately, we have another panel to take up closely related issues. But I want to thank my co-panelists here who have been absolutely terrific, and I want to thank you for your engagement and your questions.
Me, and also thanking Jacques for a fabulous job moderating. Bridget, Kelsey, thank you. Guys, it's been a great panel, and we will reconvene in 10 minutes exactly for our next panel. There are restrooms directly behind me here and more upstairs. So a quick break, and then we'll be back to it. Thank you.